Good evening, everybody. My name is Milan Narayan. I will be the moderator today. I am the Austin ambassador for Texas Gun Sense. Texas Gun Sense, just a brief introduction. So, Texas Gun Sense is unwavering in its commitment to end gun violence, and we work to advance safer gun laws at the legislature, most importantly and primarily, but we also work to build and improve safe gun culture in Texas. And of course, it's very apposite now being in June being Gun Violence Awareness Month. In 2025, it's the 10-year anniversary of June's recognition of being Gun Violence Awareness Month. And one of the most important things in this conversation today and tonight is that it's about stories and about action and about imagining a safer future together. And we know that the crisis of gun violence is not abstract, but neither are the solutions. And they begin here with courage, truth, and most importantly, with each other. So we have a wonderful panel today with three incredible speakers. So first, I'd like to introduce Jessica Wood, a mother turned advocate after the tragic loss of her child to gun violence. She is now committed to transforming grief into policy change and community healing. We also have Dr. Tatiana Cardenas, a Central Texas trauma surgeon and medical educator who treats the devastating injuries caused by gun violence and advocates passionately for prevention and systemic change. Then we also have Faith Mata, a sister turned advocate after the tragic loss of her 10-year-old sibling in the Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde, now dedicated to honoring her memory through national advocacy and community-driven change. So thank you so much to all the panelists for coming. And I'd like to kick it off by just opening up the floor to all three of you. So this question is kind of for everybody. So, each of you brings a very personal and powerful perspective to the issue. And what first moved you to speak out or get involved in advocacy? And I guess we can go to Jessica first.
I take myself off mute. I lost my son Colton. He was only 16 years old. He was a soccer player, an avid gamer, smart, funny, kind. He actually dreamed of becoming a future chemical engineer. He had his whole life ahead of him. But in January, Colton was shot and killed. It wasn't an intentional shooting, but it was still traumatic, and one moment changed everything. And the days after Colton died, I was drowning in grief. But even in that darkness, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't let his story disappear. I couldn't let his life be reduced to a headline or to a statistic. So, what moved me to speak out was the need to honor his memory in a way that meant something. I couldn't save him, but I could fight for others. I could take my pain and I could turn it into purpose. I believe that Colton's death might have been preventable. And when something is potentially preventable, then silence is no longer an option. I just recently started speaking, really initially to just anybody who would listen. But the more I speak, the more I realize how many families are carrying the same grief, the same anger, and the same fear. So advocacy has become the way that I keep mothering Colton. It's how I carry his name forward. So every time I speak, I do it with him in mind. I do it because I love him, and I do it because I believe we can and must build a safer world for our children. So that enduring love is what drives me.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jessica. And I'm so sorry for your loss. And I know it takes so much strength and courage to get out there in the field. And this field is just so daunting. And every single day, news breaks and you hear something. Um, and it's what you said is so important about how behind each number, it's a life. It's a life, it's a family, it's a dinner table, and there's so many stories to be told. And there's so many communities affected by gun violence prevention and gun violence. And so I guess next I'd like to move to you, Faith. What kind of spurred you into the movement and what first moved you to speak out and get involved in advocacy?
Yeah, so for me, I didn't become involved in advocacy until my family and I lost my younger sister, Tess, after May 24th, and waiting almost 2 weeks to bury her. I couldn't just bear the thought of not having my sister. I knew in my heart that I did not want Tessa's passing to mean nothing and do nothing. I couldn't claim to be an older sister and only fight and protect her while she was alive. So I became more vocal about gun violence. I shared concerns with political leaders, local news stations, and any individual I met with. I spoke on how a tragedy like what happened at Robb Elementary affected my family and 18 other families in Uvalde. And just a call to action to or for common sense gun laws. I made a promise to Tess that her death wouldn't be in vain, and Tess would touch the hearts of many and leave lasting memories with individuals that we share her story with.
Thank you so much, Faith. And once again, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I still remember the day of May 24th, 2022, and hearing about what happened at Robb Elementary and the needless gun violence, the number of lives that were lost. It was jarring. It's the end of the school year, and they're elementary school students who were excited, happy, and hopeful for the summer, to get to June, July, and it was such a shock to so many of us. And thank you so much for your advocacy and for your work in the policy arena as well. And then now to you, Dr. Cardenas, because your perspective is very interesting as a trauma surgeon. So what kind of got you motivated to speak out about gun violence prevention, and what kind of spurred you into the advocacy arena as well?
Yeah, what first got me involved, well, kind of backtracking to 2017, November of 2017, the Sutherland Springs shooting happened, and I was one of the surgeons in a university hospital in San Antonio that responded to that mass shooting. And it was tragic. It was awful. It was the first time that in San Antonio at that hospital that we had kind of gone through something like that. And it was horrible for, of course, the families. It was just really jarring for our community to see that kind of just mass sort of massacre. And it was pretty awful. Fast forward to May 24th, 2022, the Robb Elementary School shooting. At that point, I was a new mom. I had a 1-year-old. We had just sort of escaped the jaws of COVID, kind of. I don't even know if we can call it escaped, but at that point, we were in another kind of time, and at that point, it hit much differently. Despite having treated hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of gunshot wound victims in my career up to that point, it was jarring, it was shocking, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing one more life to gun violence. And so serendipitously, actually, two of my friends, fellow physician moms, they started a group called Texas Moms Making Decisions. And so Lauren Gamble and Ashley Trust, and they partnered with Texas Gun Sense and Nicole on several occasions, and we've worked together, and through different initiatives, we've been able to really participate and use our voices, and just to kind of move the needle and help things a little bit with regards to making this state a better place and a safer place for our kids.
Yeah, and that's really interesting how your story came from after Sutherland Springs and then moving into Robb, because when we hear statistics, of course, but we also see headlines, and we can get desensitized to both. But when you're there and when you see individuals, when you're treating individuals, but when you also, even in media, when you see the images, the videos, I think it's a reminder, a very jarring, profound reminder, again, that these are people, and some of the violence that's been inflicted, and some of the stories we've heard, people who unable to recognize their family members, after someone getting shot with an assault weapon. It's a jarring reminder. And so thank you so much for your work in the healthcare arena and in the policy arena as well. And so I'd like to ask you, Jessica, just more specific question, more personal question. So you talked a little bit earlier about honoring Colton's memory through your advocacy. So what are some of the changes, at home, in schools, and the law that you hope to see to make other families safer?
Yeah, so honoring Colton's memory means doing everything I can to prevent any other family having to experience the kind of loss that we did. And that starts with real concrete changes at home, in school, and in our laws. At home, we need to take gun storage seriously. So if a firearm is in a home with children and teens, it needs to be locked away and inaccessible to them. Children and teens can make split-second decisions without fully understanding consequences. So a moment of access can mean a lifetime of loss. In schools, I want to see more honest conversations, not just the drills and fear, but real education about safety, conflict resolution, and how to ask for help. We need stronger support for mental health in general because our kids are carrying so much as it is, and we need to stop expecting them to just silently cope. Legally, we need common sense gun reform. So that would be, safe storage laws, stronger background checks, raising the minimum age for purchasing firearms. I'm also a strong believer in education requirements for gun ownership. We require driver's licenses and training to operate a car, but not to own a weapon. And that gap really doesn't make any sense. So, one thing that I'm personally focused on a lot in Texas right now is that it's legal to gift a handgun to a 17-year-old. That might sound incorrect, but it's true. It's not just hunting rifles at that age. So, we don't consider 17-year-olds legal adults in so many other areas of life, but we allow them to receive a gun with no training required, no safe storage requirements, no true accountability. 17 is it's simply too young. And we need to close the loopholes that allow dangerous or untrained access under the guise of gifting. If we care about safety, then the laws have to reflect that because what's legal isn't always what's safe. I'm not personally calling for anything extreme. I'm asking for very basic common sense changes that might have saved my son's life. It could save others. It's never about taking away rights or impeding anyone's Second Amendment right, but it's always about protecting lives.
And I think the last thing that you touched on is very imminent as well, because what we've seen in polling data and just in voter data is that these things are popular. All these proposals are popular, they're common sense, not just in the United States, but also in Texas and across, both sides of the political spectrum. So this is a nonpartisan issue, bipartisan issue, but really it's a nonpartisan issue. And everyone wants to see a safer Texas. And so the other thing that you talked about that really stuck with me is talking about changing the culture. We can change things in the laws, we can change things at schools, but having conversations at school, having conversations at home, by changing the culture, you're already kind of solving some of the problems with loopholes that we see. And then obviously that can create a feedback loop into the law as well. And I guess that's a good segue into you, Dr. Cardenas, because from your view as a trauma surgeon, I'm sure that there are a lot of misconceptions, there's a lot of conversations, and maybe not enough conversations in some realms about the real aftermath of gun violence. So, what do you think and what do you wish more people understood about the aftermath of gun violence and some of the effects of gun violence in the medical field?
A lot. So, first of all, gunshot wounds are considered penetrating trauma, so in a category like stab wounds, except unlike stab wounds, gunshot wounds are much higher velocity mechanism of injury, and so the damage it leaves behind is significant. Most movies I go back to movies because I think that's the thing that most people can sort of grapple with, the idea of like injuries with gunshot wounds, TV shows, things like that. Most things that we see on the media, it's, oh, well, the hole's there. Oh, let's, put something on it and close it up. The big problem with gunshot wounds is that it causes internal hemorrhage and internal damage. So holes in the intestines that have to be explored and fixed, bleeding from blood vessels from the major blood vessel in the body called the aorta to blood vessels that supply the small intestine, the spleen, the liver, and this can cause massive internal hemorrhage. And most gunshot wounds, especially to the trunk, are explored surgically, meaning they have to go to the operating room in an emergent situation, in an emergent way. When we, just to kind of give you a 30,000-foot view, and when I say we, my team and I, and my, my practice partners, my fellow surgeons, trauma surgeons at the hospital, we are waiting for gunshot wounds in the trauma bay to arrive when we know we're getting a gunshot wound. So we get a page, it's the highest acuity level. We wait in the trauma bay and everyone is there. X-ray technologists, nurses, respiratory therapists, the emergency medicine doctors are there to help intubate or put patients on the ventilator if they need to be. Blood bank is there, anesthesia is there. I mean, it's a massive kind of group of people, and it's all organized chaos is what I like to call it. From 30,000-foot view, it looks like it's chaotic, but everybody has a role, everybody has a thing that they're doing, and as the trauma surgeon, we're running the room and making the decision on whether to go to the operating room or not. And that's just when the patient walks in. So within 9 minutes, we make a decision. Less than 10 minutes, we're in the operating room cutting if we need to be. And so that's first and foremost, which can be very traumatic to a patient who's awake. And not just that, but once they've sort of woken up and come out of it and their injuries have, the intestinal holes have been sewed shut and the bleeding has stopped. That's literally our job as trauma surgeons, is to stop the bleeding. They usually are going to the surgical ICU. Once the hospitalization has sort of come to, and they're able to be discharged, the aftermath and the care and the healing and the financial toxicity and the stress and the mental healing of the family and everybody that's surrounding the patient, that's when that starts. So never mind the fact that the patient's been in the hospital for 2 weeks. They haven't been to work. They can't work because of whatever, because of the injuries or because of their physical limitations secondary to the injuries that they've sustained. So that's where the financial toxicity piece comes in, the stress piece of it, the PTSD after being in an ICU, which is well documented in any ICU, really. And then the sort of mental and healing that is required because of that traumatic event and being shot. Many times patients won't necessarily remember what's happened in their hospitalization while they were in the ICU, because many times they're ventilated on the ventilator and sedated, but there's a lot of PTSD around that incident. And it's not just PTSD for the patient, but for their family and for the people that surround them, for their kids. I can't tell you how many times I've, being a mom has made me a better surgeon, and how many times I've had to, talk to kids about the injuries that their parents, or, vice versa, the injuries that, a child has sustained, and talking to parents about, hey, here are the next steps. This is what's happening. This is how, I mean, the aftermath for the family is huge. And so there's a lot that I wish people knew. It's not just about, putting bandage on the hole and, covering the hole up. There's damage behind that we can't see. And that's precisely what we're trained to identify early on without a whole lot of imaging or CT scans or anything fancy, and identify that and act quickly in an emergent and quick fashion to be able to save someone's life. But again, the healing just starts when the patient's discharged, I feel like.
And I think when you talk about looking at it from 30,000-foot view, we see there's so much intersectionality with so many other issues. I mean, we talk about when someone has to get intubated, or there needs to be, emergency responders on the scene, and then they're, transported to the hospital, into an operating room if need be, into an ICU potentially. There's conversations about access to healthcare involved in that. There's conversations about in what you just talked about, the effects for the individual, going forward, if they're going to have to be, intubated or in the ICU for weeks on end. They're not going to be able to work. What's going to happen with their job? What's going to happen? There's so many conversations. And so the media representations that we get are superficial in so many different ways, because they don't tell those stories. They don't tell the stories of the individual, of the family, of the providers who are there to help. And then at the same time, when we see in movies or in TV shows, what we often see is, someone gets hit, but then, they get back up, or someone gets hit and then they pass away immediately on scene. And we know that there are, 40,000 people who die from gun violence every year, but there are hundreds of thousands of people who are injured every single year. And the long-lasting effects for them, for their families, for their communities, are, as you mentioned, just so under-discussed. And so I really appreciate you sharing that perspective as a trauma surgeon, as a healthcare provider. I really appreciate you sharing that perspective.
Absolutely.
So for you, Faith, of course, after what happened in Uvalde, you've spoken out in both local and national spaces, as you mentioned. What do you think has been most meaningful to you in this work, and what's kind of helped keep you going, especially as every single day it feels like we hear new discouraging news or news that really just kind of hits us every single day?
Yeah, no, I know you mentioned I've spoken at local and national spaces, and I've had the honor of being a part of those meaningful spaces for conversations. But I think the most meaningful would be leaving a piece of Tess everywhere I go. Um, as much as I would love to be in a present moment right now with my sister, I just find it so meaningful that I get to talk about her to others, sharing her likes, her dislikes, quirks, attitudes, and it almost feels like she isn't gone. And it just makes it more meaningful to continue doing this work. And I think that also ties into what keeps me going. It's her. Um, I live by myself in a big city in Austin. I work full time, getting my master's, advocating, and it can all just be so tiring and consuming. But I remind myself daily that I feel that I'm no longer just living my life for myself. I feel like I'm living it for my sister who can't. Um, so I've had conversations with several siblings from Uvalde who also lost their siblings. And I feel like we've come to a time in our lives where we feel that we want to go and we want to speak about our siblings. We want to go and try different foods, go to all the concerts we can, because it's just it feels good knowing that wherever I go, there's a part of her that is with me. So I would think that is my sister's what definitely keeps me going.
I really appreciate that. And I think that also strikes at the heart of what Dr. Cardenas was talking about, and also what Jessica was talking about in terms of the healing process. It looks different for every single person, but the healing process is so necessary um, when this problem is just so widespread. And it's so important to have structures and institutions that help support survivors, but families of survivors, the community surrounding survivors, and just ensuring that there is that support, there is that love, there is that care. And so the way that you share your story and the way that you share your sibling story, it's powerful, it's transcendent. I really appreciate you sharing your story with us and you sharing some of her story as well. And so I guess that's a good way to ask you, Jessica. So when you were talking about honoring Colton, um, people hear gun violence prevention and they think a lot about statistics, politics, policies, and that's, kind of what I asked you about in your last question. Um, but really at the heart of it, for people who are in the space, it's about honoring the people. Um, and so what would you want people who are listening right now, who listen to your story, listen to Colton's story, what do you want those people to carry forward from your story and from Colton's story?
I definitely agree with you that it's easy for the conversation to get stuck in the numbers and politics and policy debates. And I get it. I mean, the statistics are staggering, honestly. But as someone who's lost a child to gun violence, I'm just here to say the statistics aren't the story. Children such as Colton are the story. Colton had a full, messy, beautiful life ahead of him. He wasn't a number, he was a human being. And when we reduce these tragedies to data points or move on after reading yet another headline, we completely can lose sight of that. You mentioned desensitization earlier, and that's really something that I want to talk about because we have become desensitized as a society. We're a little numb to death. Especially when it's from guns. We hear about school shootings, children killed in accidental discharges, teen suicides, and we treat it all like background noise. Another tragedy, another sad story, and we scroll past it. But for those of us, who live it, it's not something you just scroll past. It's not abstract, it's permanent. It's daily. It changes everything about how you live, how you breathe, how you see the world around you. And it's devastating to know how easy it is for people to just simply look away. So the desensitization is very dangerous in my opinion, because when people stop feeling, they stop acting. And nothing will change unless we reconnect with our humanity. So we need to remember that every life lost to gun violence was someone's everything. That's someone's child, someone's friend, someone's future. Gun violence prevention isn't just about the laws, though, laws are absolutely part of it, but it's about changing how we think as a society. It's about challenging the numbness, the acceptance of loss as normal, because it's not normal. We shouldn't be just okay with burying our children. We shouldn't shrug off preventable deaths as unfortunate but inevitable. So if Colton's story can make someone feel again, can make someone stop and say, this isn't just a political issue, this is a human issue, then maybe we can start to shift that culture a little bit. So I want people to carry forward the truth that there's victims that are real, and the pain left behind is absolutely lifelong. So if we can bring back our empathy, our urgency, and more than that, our collective responsibility, then maybe fewer families will have to live in the aftermath like mine does.
And you talked about this, and we've talked about this a little bit, but culture, I think, is just the most important aspect in terms of changing what's going on in the gun violence prevention arena, because it again creates the foundation to help change laws, but it also just creates the comfort and the confidence for a mother or a father to send their kid to their friend's house without worrying about is there going to be a firearm that's not securely stored at that home. And there's so many things that we talk about in terms of culture. One of the things that I've always thought about is if you have a child with a peanut allergy, you always ask, oh, he's allergic to peanuts or she's allergic to peanuts. Make sure you just don't serve anything with peanuts whenever they go over to someone else's house. And that's just very normal, very basic. But those conversations aren't yet happening about gun violence and secure gun storage at the rate that we would love them to have. And talking, person to person, sharing those stories person to person, that's how we make change, and that's how we are able to affect other people. That's how we are able to get through to other people as well. So thank you so much for that insight, Jessica. I wholeheartedly agree, and I hope everyone is able to take away a little bit of that message about changing the culture. And so on that same train of thought, so Dr. Cardenas, a medical professional, but also a medical educator. And so healthcare professionals at every level, whether it's trauma surgeons or whether it's, PCPs or emergency response individuals or even people in the social services arena, there's an opportunity, it feels like, to kind of get out in front of the gun violence prevention issue and talk to patients or talk to the people whom they're serving. So what's one way that you see that you try to empower the next generation of healthcare professionals to speak out or make change?
I had to unmute myself. I'm sorry. So, I think something that isn't inherent in surgical residency, and that's who I teach. So the residents are the surgeons who are physicians. They've finished with their medical school and they've chosen their sort of career in surgery. And something that's not inherent is really education about the legislative process, because I think where our voice can have an impact and where it is really unique in that there's very few people in the chamber, or wherever these bills are being heard, there are few people that see what's happening in a trauma bay, for example, or in an operating room during during an operation where someone's emergently taken there because they are a gunshot wound victim. There's few people that have that sort of perspective. And so teaching the residents what the legislative process is, giving them a bit of an overview, like I said, because it's not inherent in surgical education, I think it is embedded everywhere in pediatrics, right? I mean, if you think about pediatrics and, vaccines to Medicaid, to how kids get healthcare, to regulation of different things, and like it's married to a lot of legislative sort of bills and processes and rules. But outside of pediatrics, there isn't a whole lot of, formal standardized education on how surgeons can use their voice. And while the American College of Surgeons, which is like sort of our governing body, does a really good job of doing like a leadership and advocacy summit in DC every year, that we can go to, that's something it's not a requirement, right, for every surgeon to do that. And so I think bringing that to our residents, to the surgical residents, and saying, hey, this is the process. This is how you can use your voice. These are different ways you can go to the website. You can flag different bills that it can, notify you when it's being heard. But I mean, we're very close to the Capitol, we can walk to the Capitol. And so being able to take advantage of that, it's really just taking that first step. We set aside time for our residents to vote in not just national elections, but our local elections. And so we kind of say, hey, you need to take these few hours and go vote. And, whatever it is, just use your voice. And so using like kind of giving them those types of examples and having them understand a process through which they can partake, I think is one of the most important ways to empower them to be able to use their voice and speak out in the midst of a pretty hectic career.
And when you talk about making that conscious effort and instilling that the conscious effort and the ability to use your voice, I think that's so powerful, because I think especially for medical students, I mean, I've seen firsthand with my brother, my dad, it feels very formulaic sometimes, where, you're going through, an undergrad, you're going through your classes, you struggle through organic chemistry, you take your MCAT, and then, you're done with your MCAT, you figure out where you want to go to medical school, you're going to medical school, and in medical school, you have to make sure everything's set up for step 1, step 2, and then you get to residency. Everything is so formulaic, it feels like, but at the same time, there is so much capacity, whether it is what you talked about, just sharing your voice by voting, or, being a liaison to, the Texas Medical Association. There is so many opportunities, creating a new pathway in your residency program. Because like you talked about, everything is intersectional, and it's not just gun violence, it's so many other issues, but they all kind of coalesce around this idea of gun violence. And sharing your voice is so important, so valuable. And I really appreciate you making that conscious effort to reach out to residents, medical school students, to let them know that, this generation really has the ability to speak.
And just really quick, I have my daily reminder in my office at the hospital. I would have been blessed to have met Tessa's family and Lexi and Amory and Jacqueline from the Robb Elementary shooting. And I have their pictures pinned to my pin board with little bracelets. And so for me, when the residents come into my office and, sit on my couch and tell me whatever they're, going through, or questions that they may have, they look at that and they say, oh, who are they? And I was like, well, these are victims of the Robb Elementary School shooting. And so it's something that I talk about, and that is, I'm really passionate about it. So I appreciate Jessica and Faith, what you guys have been through. I'm so sorry for your loss, and I hope I work every day so that it doesn't happen ever again. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cardenas, and for especially at the end there, just talking about sharing those stories again. I just think that's the most powerful way. And, this conversation, but just even those kind of, impromptu moments, people seeing, other individuals, people who've been affected by gun violence, and just remembering, these are people as well, and these are stories, these are lives behind it. And so thank you so much for using your voice in the healthcare arena. And so for you, Faith, as you mentioned, you've used your voice in a couple different spaces, nationally, locally. What do you wish lawmakers would truly listen to from families like yours who have lost someone to gun violence, or especially in school shootings? What do you think lawmakers should listen to from families like yours?
First, thank you, Dr. Cardenas, for representing Uvalde and sharing the story. We really appreciate all the work that you're doing and just being an advocate for gun violence. I would hope that lawmakers would hear real life stories that are happening to actual individuals and families. Gun violence has become way too common, that many of our lawmakers, I feel, are so desensitized to the issue, like we've spoken on today. I will never forget testifying before Congress and sharing Tessa's story and the details of the day that we lost her. And across from me is Ohio House Representative Jim Jordan. And he is on his phone texting while I was speaking and sharing my family's story. I felt disappointed. I felt angry. It was just an unfathomable moment for me, considering this was my first time ever in DC, getting to meet with US House representatives and Senate members, and it just made me realize that some of our political leaders don't feel the same way and aren't treating this like an issue. So I would like lawmakers to know that the lack of urgency on the issue, I believe it's a form of dehumanization to families that were affected. We lost someone, like Jessica said, a living human, a child, mom, dad, sister. When we delay action or dismiss someone's loss, it sends a message that our loved ones, their lives were almost disposable, that our pain was inconvenient, and just that our voices don't matter. So every day that goes by without this meaningful change, I feel is another day that a family can be shattered like mine. And, you know, we just don't always need the sympathy, but accountability and action from our lawmakers.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'm so sorry, not just for your loss, but for that experience. I mean, I know it takes so much courage to not just to testify, just to share any sort of experience like that. And then, going all the way to Washington, sharing your story in front of lawmakers, and to have people turn their back to you. And as you mentioned, just treat the story as if it's inconvenient. This is a person that we were talking about. This is a family that we were talking about. This is you sharing your story. And mustering up that courage to share that story. I'm so sorry for that. And that's why I really thank all the participants and attendees who were on today. Thank you so much for being here and taking time out of your day to listen to these stories and listen to these perspectives, because as we've mentioned, they can't get lost. Like, they just cannot get lost. Stories and people transcend numbers, figures, headlines, in the daily commotion and chaos that we feel. And being able to share those stories, hear those stories, and internalize them is how we're able to kind of reconcile the craziness that we hear and experience every single day. So thank you so much to all the attendees and to the panelists for sharing your perspectives and your experiences. So the last thing that I would want to do before we open it up to questions from the chat, just in a couple sentences or so, or a sentence or two, what is one action or message you'd like people to take from this conversation tonight for all the attendees listening? And we can start with anyone who, comes to mind first, or anyone who has something off the top of their head.
Go to the Texas Gun Sense website and get involved read about the impact, read about different resources that they have. There's advocacy toolkits. There's just kind of education on how the legislative session works and how to get involved. And yes, you can testify. It's can be a little bit difficult with regards to how quickly bills are heard, the notification of how between them announcing a bill is going to be heard and it being heard. But there are other ways that you can get involved. And so the Texas Gun Sense website is a really good way to start, and your voice matters. Your voice matters.
I'll kind of piggyback off that because I fully agree. This isn't just about politics. This is about protecting the people that we love. So let your heartbreak and your disappointment push you to action. Vote, speak out, demand change. It does make a difference. And remember, every child that's been lost could have been one of your loved ones too. And they all deserve better. We all do.
To also go off of this conversation, start those conversations. I think you would be surprised how many people are unaware of the lack of gun reform or gun laws that we don't have, or what's going on in certain communities. I think just being able to educate a neighbor, educate someone on what they can do, or just how to start a conversation. And I would also like to add, I think just be in the moment with your loved ones. Don't take the time you are given for granted. I know many of you have probably heard this far too often, but it's true. Take the pictures, record videos, and just be present in your daily lives.
Yes, thank you so much for all of you for sharing your stories. For me, I mean, I just think, for me, I think we would all be surprised by the number of people who are, for lack of a better word, just outraged by what is going on, but really just don't fully know or haven't been able to contextualize the extent of the problem. When like I tell someone that I was standing 100 feet away from a shooting in my school when I was in high school, people are like, "That's ridiculous. Why should that ever have happened to you?" When someone shares a story of a family member getting killed, or working and seeing every single day victims of gunshot wounds in the operating room in the ICU, people are outraged. But it's like what you were talking about, Faith. We need to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and starting those uncomfortable conversations, because people really do listen, and the only way for people to hear is if you share, because unfortunately there's just not enough conversation. And so we need to share, we need to get out there. And so again, thank you so much for all of you for being here, and for listening to our stories. And hopefully you can carry on your own personal stories as well, or the messages that you've heard today. So I did see there were a couple questions in the chat. The first one I think was for Dr. Cardenas. So the question came from Rose Williams. And so the question was, do you have violence interrupters in your hospital or a trauma survivor network to help patients and their families with wraparound services?
There's a regional network that we refer patients to. And then in terms of violence interrupters, we do have violence prevention, not only within the trauma services section, but also in the hospital that do see all of our victims of gunshot wounds. So yes.
Okay, thank you for this. And then for Jessica, for Faith, what are your thoughts on holding safe spaces like healing circles, for example, within our communities? What are your thoughts on kind of having those safe spaces in our communities?
Holding safe spaces such as healing circles is a really compassionate response to the trauma caused by gun violence. Gun violence not only causes the physical harm, obviously, but it leaves deep emotional and psychological wounds. So I think healing circles can help break the silence that often surrounds that pain. They can also foster empathy and community cohesion. So those are crucial for long-term healing and prevention.
Agree with Jessica. I think that these spaces are definitely essential. I immediately think about the kids that were at Rob and how in Uvalde currently, I don't believe there is a space for these kids or for the teachers that were there. So I do think it's very essential, especially for young kids who are going through this stuff. It's a long-lasting trauma. It's something that needs to be talked about and feel comfortable in the spaces that you're sharing these things in.
I fully agree with you. And I think for young people, especially who are, as we now know, gun violence is a leading cause of death for youth 18 and under. And when we talk about internalizing, but also normalizing that culture of gun violence, that we shouldn't, we should not be normalizing the culture of gun violence. And especially for young people, like there is no reason that um, after something traumatic happens to them or their peers, we should just move on the next day as if nothing happened. And so I thank you so much for sharing some of your insights and your perspectives on holding safe spaces for communities, especially for young people as well. Thank you there, Faith and Jessica. Um, and so I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in. We can also relay them to the panelists as well, and we can get those answered for you if you don't want to ask in the chat. But seeing no other questions, thank you so much for all of you for sharing your experiences. Thank you so much for Texas Gun Sense, Lives Rob, for setting this up. For all the people who are here and listening, some of the things that you can do, again, it's June, it's Gun Violence Awareness Month. You can get involved, whether that's, I think Garrett dropped a couple links in the chat with the advocacy toolkit, but also just the general website for Texas Gun Sense. But you can share your voice too, and it's a little daunting sometimes testifying. It's also a little inconvenient just because you don't know when they're going to hear your bill that you're going to testify on. But just being there and being in the moment, as we've kind of talked about today, and hearing some of the perspectives and experiences from other people, I think is really powerful. And just being there, we all have this access to the Capitol, and we have, if you're in Austin, it's powerful. And so even if you can't, there are other ways to get involved. Of course, you can donate, but you can also share stories, whether it's virtually, social media, word of mouth. Please just share. Keep in touch with TGS Lives Robbed. Follow us on social media. And one thing that I just want to close on, change comes from stories, but it also comes from showing up together. And that's what we are here doing today. And so, there however many people there, 22 people on this call, but 22 people can soon become 44. It can soon become 88. It can become a whole movement. And as I mentioned before, people really become outraged when they hear about the true depth of the problem with gun violence and some of the ignorance when it comes to people who are sharing their stories about how gun violence has affected them and afflicted them. So thank you so much for all the panelists. Thank you so much for all the attendees. Please, we invite you to stay involved with Texas Gun Sense. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. See you all later.
Thank you.